They were born as children, but sold like objects before they could walk. The world had already decided their value, not by who they were, but by how strange they looked. One body, two minds, millions of eyes staring. This is not a horror story. This really happened. In America. And the worst part? What you're about to hear was considered entertainment. July 1851. The heat pressed down on the Whitefield plantation in North Carolina like a hand that never lifted. The air smelled of damp soil, sweat, and long-learned submission. This was a place where people were not born to become themselves, but to belong to someone else. In a small wooden cabin set away from the main house, Monmia McCoy lay on a narrow bed, her body trembling with pain. This was not her first childbirth. 7 children had already passed through her arms and into the same future. Lives of labor, obedience, and silence. All of them born enslaved. All of them claimed before they ever took their first steps. Outside, Jacob McCoy stood with his hands clenched at his sides. He was not allowed inside. Enslaved men rarely were. For someone like Jacob, the birth of a child was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of fear. A healthy child meant work. A weak one meant loss. And anything unusual meant danger. The first cry broke through the cabin walls. Then it didn't stop. The midwife froze. Silence followed. Thick, unnatural silence. When the child was lifted into view, the room seemed to tighten around itself. There were 2 heads, 2 small faces, 2 uneven breaths, but only one body, joined at the lower back and spine, bound together by flesh that could not be separated. No one spoke. There was no language for this. No medical explanation. No compassion shaped by understanding. Only instinctive fear. Fear of what could not be named. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else turned away, as if looking too long would invite punishment. The children were named Millie and Christine. Together. They weighed 17 pounds. The number spread quickly, repeated again and again, growing heavier with each telling. By the next day, word had already traveled beyond Whitefield. People left their fields. They brought their children. They came on foot and horseback to see what they called the strange twins. To them, Millie and Christine were not children. They were a spectacle for Alexander McKay, the plantation owner. The twins were not a miracle or a mystery. They were a problem. Crowds disrupted the routine. Eyes lingered where discipline was meant to rule. The plantation, once governed by order and fear, had become a place of curiosity. Millie and Christine knew nothing of this. They knew hunger, cold, the dull ache of a body that had to learn how to breathe and move as one. Despite wanting different things, they could not turn away from each other. They could not be held separately. Every movement required negotiation. Every moment of rest was a fragile balance. Monmia held them close, her arms shaking but steady. She did not know what future waited for her daughters, but she understood one truth with painful clarity. The world would not be kind to children like these. More people came. Some laughed. Some stared too long. Some asked McKay outright what he planned to do with them. Not the girls, not the children. Them, as if they were an object, not 2 lives breathing in her arms. Alexander McKay's patience thinned before Millie and Christine were even 10 months old. The decision was made. It was quick, practical, cold. They were sold, not 2 daughters, Not two human beings, but something with value. McKay sold them to a man named John C. Purvis, attaching a single spoken condition, no papers, no protection, that Monmia would be allowed to go with them. It was not kindness. It was convenience. That was the first time Millie and Christine were passed from one set of hands to another. It would not be the last. When the wagon rolled away from Whitefield, no one watched it leave. The plantation returned to its rhythm: cotton, commands, and silence. Only somewhere along a dirt road, beneath a cloud of red dust, two infants began a life that did not belong to them. A life where their bodies would never be private. A life where being born was the first thing taken from them. And this was only the beginning. The wagon moved slowly along the red dirt road, its wheels groaning with every turn. Inside, Monmia held both of her daughters close, one small head pressed against the other, their breaths uneven but alive. Each jolt sent a shiver through their shared body. Millie whimpered. Christine stayed silent, her eyes open, watching a world she did not understand. They were leaving Whitefield behind. But they were not escaping it. John C. Purvis did not hide the children. He didn't need to. Wherever the wagon stopped, at a farm, a roadside inn, a small town, people noticed. Two heads, one body. Curiosity pulled them closer like gravity. At first, the looks were cautious. Then came the questions. Are they real? How do they live like that? Were they born this way? Purvis answered just enough to keep interest alive. He did not embellish. He didn't need to. The truth alone was enough to make people lean in. Rumors began to move faster than the wagon itself. By the time Millie and Christine arrived in the next town, people were already waiting. Word spread through churches, taverns, and marketplaces. Each retelling sharpened the story, twisting it slightly, adding fear or wonder depending on the teller. Some called them a sign from God. Others called them a curse. Most simply wanted to see. Millie and Christine could not speak yet, but they understood something essential. They were being watched. Not glanced at. Watched. Studied. Weighed with eyes that lingered too long. When strangers leaned in, Millie turned her face away. Christine did not. She stared back, quietly, as if trying to understand why so many eyes felt so heavy. Monmia felt it too. She tried to shield them, turning their bodies inward, pulling cloth higher around their backs. But curiosity does not respect boundaries. People stepped closer. Some reached out before thinking better of it. Hands hovered in the air, unsure whether touching was allowed. The children became a story told by strangers who never learned their names. It did not take long for Purvis to realize what he was carrying. Not children, but value. He had paid for them, yes, but he lacked the money and nerve to exploit what others already saw so clearly. Wherever they stopped, someone asked the same question in a different way. Are they for sale? The second sale came quickly. Millie and Christine were transferred again, this time to Brower, a man with ambition and financial backing from Joseph P. Smith. The price was staggering. $10,000. Enough money to change lives. Enough to erase hesitation. With that exchange, something shifted. Millie and Christine were no longer treated as a strange accident of birth. They became an investment. Brower gave them a new name almost immediately: the Carolina Twins. It sounded friendly, marketable, safe. The old names, Millie and Christine McCoy, faded into the background, tied to slavery, family, and a past that no longer mattered to the people in charge. The first exhibitions were small: a rented room, a few benches, a crowd that paid to enter. Brower stood nearby, watching faces instead of the children. He paid attention to reactions: shock, disbelief, fascination. The girls were placed where everyone could see them. There was no performance yet, no movement requested, just presence. Millie and Christine sat quietly, their shared bodies stiff with tension. They didn't understand why strangers stared. They only knew that every pair of eyes felt like pressure against their skin. Millie kept her gaze low. Christine scanned the room, her eyes restless. Whispers filled the space. "They're faking it. It can't be real. Look at the way they breathe." Someone demanded proof. Doctors were summoned, not to help, but to confirm. Millie and Christine were laid out under harsh light. Hands pressed gently, then less gently, against the place where their bodies joined. The examination was clinical, detached, and entirely public. The verdict was announced aloud. The twins were real. The crowd reacted with relief, excitement, even joy. The truth satisfied them. It gave them permission to stare without guilt. From that moment on, the exhibitions grew. More towns, bigger crowds, more money. Millie and Christine were no longer children being passed along. They were something people traveled to see. Their days fell into a rhythm they never chose. Wake, be dressed, be displayed, be returned to silence. Monmia stayed close when she was allowed. When she wasn't, she waited. She watched from corners and doorways, listening to her daughter's breaths change when they were overwhelmed. At night, she whispered their real names to them. Millie, Christine. She said them softly, like a spell meant to keep something human alive. But the world outside was louder. Every mile carried them further from anything resembling privacy. Every exhibition taught them that their bodies were not their own, and slowly, without anyone noticing the moment it happened, their childhood began to slip away, not stolen all at once, but worn down by hands, eyes, and voices that never stopped asking for more. They were still very young, but already, they were learning what it meant to exist for others. No one ever asked Millie and Christine if they were tired. By the time they were carried into larger halls and louder rooms, exhaustion had become a constant state, something that lived in their bones. Their bodies were heavier now. Every movement required more effort. Every breath came with awareness of the other. The crowds kept growing. At the North Carolina State Fair in October of 1853, thousands passed through the exhibition each day. People stood shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks, sweating under the weight of curiosity. The Carolina twins were no longer a rumor. They were an attraction. Some doubted what they saw. Some accused Brower of trickery. Some demanded proof. Brower gave it to them. Doctors were invited again, this time publicly, formally, as part of the show. Millie and Christine were placed beneath bright light, their clothing adjusted, their shared spine examined. The language was professional. The tone was detached, but the setting was unmistakable. This was not care. This was confirmation. When the verdict was announced, authentic conjoined twins, the room erupted, not in sympathy, but in satisfaction. The audience had received what they paid for, certainty, and certainty made the twins valuable. Offers began to arrive almost immediately. Some were cautious, others were bold. Brower listened, nodded, waited. He understood markets. He understood scarcity. And Millie and Christine were rare in a way money recognized. Then one offer stood apart. $45,000. A fortune. More than Brower had ever imagined earning from them. Enough to erase doubt, to silence conscience, to make hesitation feel foolish. The buyer spoke confidently, smoothly, promised discretion. promised quick payment. Brower accepted. The exchange happened quietly. Too quietly. Within days. Millie and Christine were gone. No public announcement. No final exhibition. No explanation. The man who had agreed to buy them vanished, along with the twins and every trace of the promised money. Brower had been deceived. The realization came slowly. Then all at once, panic followed, accusations, desperation. He searched, questioned, threatened, but the trail was already cold. Millie and Christine had been stolen. For weeks. No one knew where they were. Monmia asked questions no one answered. She pleaded. She was ignored, in a world governed by contracts and claims. A black woman's grief carried no weight. Rumors filled the silence. Some said the twins had died. Some said they had been taken north. Some whispered that they were being hidden until their price rose again. The truth surfaced a year later in Philadelphia, where Millie and Christine appeared inside a museum, displayed as curiosities among glass cases and preserved oddities. They were older now, their faces thinner, their eyes sharper. They no longer reacted to crowds with confusion alone. There was caution there now, recognition, a quiet awareness that attention meant exposure, and exposure meant danger. The reappearance ignited a battle. Brower demanded his property back. Joseph P. Smith asserted ownership. Even Alexander Mackay resurfaced, claiming regret and rights long abandoned. 3 men, 3 claims. One truth left unspoken. None of them spoke of Millie and Christine as people. Only Monmia spoke that way. Smith prevailed, determined to reclaim what he believed belonged to him. He hired a private investigator. The trail led north, then further still. The twins had been taken to P.T. Barnum's American Museum in New York, where human difference was packaged as wonder. From there, the journey widened. Canada, then across the Atlantic, Liverpool, England. Millie and Christine crossed an ocean before they understood what an ocean was. By the time they were found, they were 5.5 years old. The reunion with Monmia was real, but fractured. Their bodies remembered her touch. Their minds hesitated. Too many hands had held them. Too many voices had spoken over them. And yet, even after they were reclaimed, nothing truly changed. They were still exhibited, still displayed, still watched. Only now, their world was larger, louder, more permanent. Chapter 1 ends here, not with freedom, but with survival. 2 children had endured birth, sale, disappearance, and return. They had crossed borders without consent and learned, far too early, that their bodies carried value others would always seek to claim. They were still alive, but their lives no longer belonged to them. No one used their real names anymore. When Millie and Christine were brought back into public view, they were introduced with a name that sounded clean, harmless, almost cheerful. The Carolina Twins. It appeared on posters. It was spoken by announcers. It was repeated until it replaced the truth. Millie and Christine did not know what Carolina meant. They did not understand why they were called twins when they could never move apart. What they understood was simpler. Whenever that name was spoken loudly, lights came on, and their bodies were expected to be present. Their first true stage was not grand. It was a rented hall with wooden benches and low ceilings. The air was thick with sweat and anticipation. People paid at the door and waited inside, whispering to one another as if they were about to witness something forbidden. Then, the curtain was pulled back. Millie and Christine were brought forward, seated where everyone could see them. There was no music, No dramatic reveal, just the sudden weight of hundreds of eyes settling onto their shared body. The silence lasted only a moment. Then came the murmurs. Some people leaned forward. Others stood. A few crossed themselves. One woman turned away, covering her mouth. A man laughed, quickly, nervously, before realizing no one else was laughing with him. Millie stared straight ahead. Christine looked to the side. Two reactions, two ways of coping. The manager stood nearby, speaking in a steady voice. He explained what the audience was seeing. He listed details as facts, not feelings, where they were joined, what organs were shared, what made them unique. Every word stripped something away. Millie and Christine were not asked to speak. They were not asked how they felt. Their silence was part of the presentation, after the show. The money was counted, the hall emptied. The whispers followed the crowd out into the street. Some said they felt disturbed. Others said they wanted to see more. Several said they would bring friends next time. That was all that mattered. The exhibitions became regular. Town after town, hall after hall, each place larger than the last. The Carolina twins became something people recognized before they ever arrived. Posters preceded them. Rumors built anticipation. And Millie and Christine learned routine. They learned when they would be woken, when they would be washed, when their clothes would be adjusted, when they would be carried out into light. They learned that resistance made things harder, that stillness was safer than protest, that attention could not be escaped, only endured. Doctors were still invited, not always, but often enough, each time. The examinations were framed as necessary, educational, scientific. But the children knew the truth. Hands touched them where hands should not linger. Eyes traced their bodies without permission. Conversations happened about them, never with them. Monmia tried to remain close, but her presence was increasingly treated as an inconvenience. She was asked to step back, to wait outside, to remain silent so the audience would not be distracted. She watched her daughters from corners and shadows, memorizing their breathing, noting every flinch. Millie and Christine began to notice differences between themselves. Millie grew restless more easily. She reacted to noise, to sudden movement. Christine seemed quieter, more observant, her eyes tracking details others ignored. They disagreed sometimes, not with words, but with tension. A turn too quick, a pause too long. Their shared body bore the cost of every difference. And yet, they also learned something no one else could teach them: coordination, to move without pain. They had to listen to each other, to breathe more easily. They had to compromise. Their survival depended on cooperation the world would never acknowledge. At night, when the noise faded and the lights dimmed, they lay awake together. No one was watching then. No one was counting money. Those moments were brief, but they were real. The next morning, the name would be spoken again. The Carolina twins. And once more, they would step into a role that was never theirs to choose. They were becoming known, but not as children, not as sisters, as something to be seen. Fame did not bring belief. It brought suspicion. As the Carolina twins appeared in more towns, a new kind of audience began to form. People who did not come to marvel, but to challenge. They stood with folded arms and narrowed eyes, whispering accusations that traveled quickly through the room. It's a trick. They're hiding something. No one is really born like that. The louder the doubt grew, the more crowded the halls became, for the managers, Skepticism was not a threat. It was fuel. A crowd divided between believers and doubters stayed longer, watched harder, argued louder. Curiosity sharpened when certainty was denied. So, the solution was simple. Proof. In New Orleans. The announcement was made before the doors even opened. A public medical examination would take place. The room filled faster than usual. People pushed forward, not wanting to miss a moment. Doctors arrived in dark coats, carrying instruments that glinted under the lamps. Their presence gave the evening a strange authority, as if knowledge itself had come to settle a dispute. Millie and Christine were brought out early. There was no chair waiting this time, only a long table, covered in white cloth. The sight of it made Monmia's hands tremble. She reached for her daughters, but was stopped gently, firmly. "This is necessary," someone told her. The children were laid down. Bright light flooded their faces. The room fell silent as doctors examined the place where their bodies joined, pressing, measuring, speaking in low voices that carried no emotion. They discussed organs and bone structure as if the girls were diagrams, not living flesh. Millie held her breath. Christine turned her face away. Their discomfort did not slow the examination. Science had been invited, and science demanded access. When the doctors finished, one of them turned to the crowd and spoke plainly. The twins were authentic, no trickery, no deception. The reaction was immediate and disturbing. Relief, excitement, applause. The audience had not come to witness pain. They had come to be satisfied. Proof gave them permission to stare without doubt, to consume without guilt. From that night on, medical verification became part of the act. In some cities, doctors examined the twins before the show. In others, during it. Each examination reinforced the same message. This is real. And reality, when rare enough, was profitable. Millie and Christine learned what that meant. Their bodies no longer belonged to quiet moments. They belonged to demonstration. Their privacy dissolved under the weight of explanation. Nothing was too intimate if it answered a question someone had paid to ask. Between exhibitions, they grew quieter. Their days blurred together. Travel, waiting, display, return. Childhood did not vanish suddenly. It faded, worn thin by repetition and exposure. There were no toys, no friends, only movement and observation. Monmia tried to keep what little normalcy she could. She spoke to them softly at night. She told stories she half remembered from her own childhood. She sang under her breath, careful not to be heard. But even then, Millie and Christine listened differently than before. They were no longer just children hearing a voice. They were children who had learned that silence could be safer than sound. They began to understand something fundamental. Their bodies attracted attention whether they wished it or not. Millie grew more sensitive to noise. Sudden laughter made her tense. Christine became watchful, tracking faces in the crowd, learning which expressions meant curiosity and which meant something worse. They were changing, not in body, but in awareness. At night, when the lights were gone and the world stopped asking for proof, the twins breathed together in the dark. In those moments, they belonged only to each other. But morning always returned, and with it came voices that spoke of them as exhibits, as wonders, as questions waiting to be answered. The Carolina twins had become something science explained and crowds demanded. Their bodies had crossed a line, from spectacle to evidence, and once crossed, there was no going back. No one ever taught Millie and Christine how to walk. Their bodies refused instruction. Two minds issued commands that rarely aligned, and one shared frame absorbed the consequences. When they tried to move forward together, imbalance followed. A step too fast from one side pulled the other off center. A hesitation sent them stumbling. At first, the falls were accidental. Wooden floors scraped skin, elbows bruised, breath knocked loose from small lungs. Each stumble ended in silence, brief, uneasy, as though the audience did not yet know how to react. Then someone laughed, not cruelly, not loudly, just a short sound, escaping before it could be swallowed. Others followed. Nervous laughter turned into something more comfortable once no one stopped it. Millie and Christine did not understand why the sound followed pain, but they noticed what came next. Attention. The managers noticed it too. At first, nothing was said. The girls were simply asked to stand again, to move, to try once more. Space was cleared so the audience could see better. The falls became more visible, the reactions more predictable. Soon, the movement itself became the focus. Millie learned to slow herself. Christine learned to anticipate, without words, without guidance. They adjusted to each other, instinctively, desperately, trying to reduce the strain on their shared spine. The result was a sideways motion, uneven, careful, not graceful by intention, but controlled enough to keep them upright. The audience reacted immediately. Applause followed the crooked step. Murmurs turned into approval. Someone called it charming. Someone else called it remarkable. A woman dabbed her eyes and said it was beautiful. No one mentioned the pain. The managers began to frame the movement as part of the exhibition. Millie and Christine were encouraged, never ordered, but clearly expected, to walk longer. Slower, more visibly. The space between benches widened. The girls were positioned where the motion could be seen from every angle. Their adaptation became a feature. What had begun as a way to survive became something people paid to watch. Millie felt the strain immediately. Every step pulled at muscles not meant to compensate. Christine felt it too, but she learned where to shift weight, where to pause. Together. They discovered a fragile rhythm that hurt less than falling, and for the first time, something changed. When they moved correctly, when they coordinated, the pain eased, slightly, enough to matter. It was a small, dangerous revelation. They had no control over where they went or who watched them, but they had some control over how they moved. At night, lying side by side in silence, they repeated the rhythm in their minds, not as performance, but as survival, a way to endure the next day with fewer bruises, fewer gasps of pain. Monmia noticed the change. The falls grew less frequent, the crying quieter. Her relief was immediate and followed closely by guilt. She understood what this meant. The world was rewarding her children not for being safe, but for turning hardship into spectacle. Each exhibition reinforced the lesson. The more deliberate the movement, the louder the applause. The applause brought approval. Approval brought money, and money ensured the routine would continue. Soon, the crooked step was no longer an accident or adaptation. It was expected. Millie and Christine were no longer simply displayed. They were directed, encouraged to walk, to turn, to show the audience what they had learned to do. The line between survival and performance blurred until it no longer existed. Millie resented the sound of applause. Christine learned to ignore it. One bristled against the attention. The other absorbed it quietly. Understanding that resistance changed nothing, their differences did not disappear. But neither did their bond. They learned each other's limits, learned when to slow, when to lean, when to breathe together. The world saw a dance, They felt a compromise. By the end of Chapter 2, something essential had shifted. Millie and Christine were no longer children reacting to circumstance. They were children adapting, shaping themselves to fit a role imposed upon them. Their pain had become visible, then acceptable, then profitable, and the applause followed them everywhere. Ahead lay a larger stage, greater risk, and a moment when their lives would once again be bought, sold, and taken. But for now, they stood together, upright and moving, under lights they could not escape. The crooked step carried them forward. By the time Millie and Christine reached their 5th year, the world had already decided what they were worth. Not in care, not in protection, but in numbers. The Carolina twins were no longer confined to small halls and local fairs. Their name traveled ahead of them, printed on handbills and spoken by people who had never seen them but were certain they wanted to. Every appearance drew larger crowds. Every crowd confirmed the same truth. Rarity multiplied demand. Brower watched this carefully. He had learned how audiences worked. He knew curiosity could be sharpened. That doubt could be turned into proof. That pain, if shaped correctly, could become applause. And now, something else became clear to him as well. The twins were reaching a peak. They were still children, still small enough to be carried if needed, still young enough to be framed as wonders rather than burdens. But their bodies were growing heavier, their needs more complex. Brower understood timing. He knew when to hold and when to sell. Offers began arriving again. At first, they were cautious, men with money but little vision. Brower declined them all. He waited, and the waiting worked. Then came an offer that changed everything. $45,000. The number did not need explanation. It stood on its own, outrageous, unprecedented, irresistible. It was more than Brower had ever imagined earning, more than the twins had ever been valued at before. The man who made the offer spoke smoothly. He claimed experience. He promised discretion. He spoke of opportunities beyond the South, larger audiences, greater respect, proper care. Brower listened. He did not ask many questions. He did not demand proof of funds. The idea of the money had already begun to replace caution. The agreement was made quickly, too quickly, the kind of speed that feels like certainty when it is actually risk. Within days, arrangements were finalized, travel plans were discussed, Brower prepared to step away richer than he had ever been. And then, silence. The buyer vanished. So did Millie and Christine. At first, Brower assumed a delay, a change in schedule, but hours became days, and days became panic. No payment arrived. No messenger returned. The places where the twins had been last seen offered no answers. The truth settled in slowly and brutally. He had been deceived. Millie and Christine had not been sold. They had been taken. The realization spread outward like shockwaves. Accusations followed, shouted, whispered, threatened. Brower searched where he could, demanded where he couldn't. But the trail was gone. The buyer had planned this carefully. He had known exactly what he was stealing. For Millie and Christine. The transition was sudden and disorienting. One day, they were being prepared for another exhibition. The next, they were on the move again, carried into unfamiliar wagons, surrounded by voices that did not bother to explain. Monmia was gone. The familiar rhythm of their days vanished. They had no way to understand what had happened, only that everything had changed. Their captors did not speak kindly. They spoke efficiently. Travel continued northward, faster than before. with fewer stops and less visibility. The twins were hidden now, not to protect them, but to preserve value. A rare thing is worth more unseen. When Millie and Christine reappeared, it was not in the South, it was in Philadelphia, inside a museum where human difference sat behind glass, labeled and categorized. Here, they were placed among preserved animals, medical curiosities, and oddities collected for display. They were alive, and yet, they belonged in a room meant for objects. By this point, their expressions had changed. They did not react to crowds with fear alone. There was calculation now, awareness, the understanding that eyes meant expectation, and expectation meant intrusion. News of their reappearance spread quickly. The dispute that followed was inevitable. Brower claimed theft. Joseph P. Smith asserted legal ownership. Alexander Mackay emerged once more. Speaking of regret, as if regret could rewrite history. 3 men argued, lawyers were consulted, claims overlapped and contradicted. Millie and Christine were never consulted. Only one person spoke for them as children. Mon Mia. She demanded her daughters back. Not as property, not as spectacle, as children. Her voice carried no authority in the rooms where decisions were made. But it did not stop her from trying. In the end, money and influence decided the outcome. Joseph P. Smith prevailed, determined to recover what he believed belonged to him. He hired a private investigator. The search stretched on, crossing state lines, following whispers and partial truths. The trail led north, then further still, New York, P.T. Barnum's American Museum. The twins had been absorbed into a larger machine, one that turned wonder into industry. And from there, the world opened wider, harsher, and far less familiar. They would soon cross borders they could not name. They would travel farther than most children ever would. And they would do it without choice. Chapter 3 had begun. What followed would take Millie and Christine beyond a single country, beyond a single owner, and deeper into a life where survival meant constant movement. They were no longer just displayed, they were disputed. The search for Millie and Christine did not end in New York. By the time Joseph P. Smith's investigator traced their path to P.T. Barnum's American Museum, the twins were already gone again. Barnum's world moved quickly. Exhibits rotated, curiosities arrived and disappeared. Human lives were folded into schedules and shipping routes. Millie and Christine were no longer treated as attractions alone. They were treated as cargo. Their journey north erased what little familiarity remained. Accents changed. Cities grew louder. Buildings rose higher. They were carried through stations and docks without explanation, wrapped in coats to conceal their faces. Shielded not for privacy, but to avoid interference. Momia was not with them. For the first time, the twins traveled without the one presence that had anchored them. Nights became longer, silence heavier, when strangers handled them. There was no familiar voice to soften the moment. Only instructions, gestures, and movement. They learned quickly not to ask. From New York, they were taken to Canada. Then, almost immediately, preparations were made for something far greater. The language around them shifted, talk of ships, crossings, arrangements, words they did not understand, but felt in the tightening pace of everything. At the port, the air smelled of salt and iron. The dock was alive with shouting men and creaking ropes. Millie and Christine were lifted aboard as if they were luggage, carefully, efficiently, without ceremony. The ocean swallowed the land behind them. Neither girl had ever seen water stretch that far. The ship moved constantly, rocking their shared body in unfamiliar rhythms. Sickness came easily. Balance was harder to find. Their nights were restless, broken by the groan of wood and the endless sound of waves. They did not know they were leaving their country. They did not know they were crossing an ocean. They only knew the world they understood had vanished. When they arrived in Liverpool, nothing felt real. The air was colder, the voices sharper, the city unfamiliar in every detail. They were moved quickly, transferred again, carried into buildings where no one spoke their names. They were exhibited briefly, quietly, enough to generate interest, enough to signal their presence. Meanwhile, the search continued. Smith's investigator followed fragments, newspaper mentions, whispered accounts, rumors passed between showmen. The trail stretched across borders and languages. Months turned into years. In 1857, after nearly 3 years, the investigator found them. Millie and Christine were in England. By then, they were 5.5 years old. Their bodies had grown. Their faces had changed. But what had changed most was their stillness. They no longer reacted openly to crowds. They no longer flinched at every sound. They had learned what constant exposure demanded. Arrangements were made quickly. Smith traveled to England, and with him came Monmia. The reunion happened in Birmingham. Monmia saw her daughters across a room filled with unfamiliar faces. For a moment, she hesitated, uncertain if the children would recognize her. Too much time had passed. Too many hands had intervened. Millie did first. Her head turned sharply at the sound of Monmia's voice. Christine followed more slowly, her eyes narrowing as memory surfaced. When Monmia reached them, her hands trembling, the twins pressed into her instinctively, bodies remembering before minds could. It was real, but it was not whole. Millie and Christine clung to her, yet something held back. Their trust had been divided too many times. Reunion did not erase the years of separation. It only layered grief over relief. For Monmia, it was victory mixed with loss. She had found her children, but she had not rescued them, because even after they were reclaimed, the pattern resumed. Millie and Christine were not returned to a quiet life. They were not removed from display. Instead, they were put back to work, this time under more controlled management. First in Britain, then later back in the United States. The exhibitions resumed with renewed interest. Their story now carried distance, mystery, survival. Audiences were larger, venues more prestigious. The twins were presented not just as curiosities, but as marvels who had crossed oceans. But the cost remained the same. They were still watched, still examined, still expected to exist for others. Only now, they understood it. Chapter 3 continued forward, no longer driven by confusion alone, but by a growing awareness that their lives would always be subject to claim. They had been stolen, they had been recovered, and yet they were still not free. Ahead lay war, education, and a shift that would give them something new, a voice. But for now, they stood on foreign ground, reunited with their mother, carrying a truth they could not yet name, that survival did not mean escape. It only meant endurance. Reunion did not mean release. When Millie and Christine were brought back under Joseph P. Smith's control, the language around them changed, but the outcome did not. They were no longer spoken of as stolen goods recovered by chance. They were now framed as assets reclaimed, preserved through effort and expense. Their return became part of the story. Audiences were told of the years they had been lost, of the ocean they had crossed, of the miracle that they were found at all. Their survival added value. Their distance added prestige. They were older now, taller, heavier, more aware. Their faces carried a seriousness that had not been there before. They did not smile easily. They did not cry publicly. They had learned, by necessity, how to hold themselves still. The exhibitions resumed first in England. The halls were larger, the crowds quieter, more restrained, but no less intent. People came dressed better, spoke softer, but stared just as long. Curiosity had not softened with manners. Millie and Christine were presented carefully, their posture guided, their movements encouraged. The crooked step, the adaptation born of pain, was now expected. Applause followed it, polite but firm, as if acknowledging something impressive rather than something necessary. Monmia stayed nearby whenever she could. Her presence was now tolerated, even welcomed as part of the narrative. She was presented as proof of care, proof of legitimacy. A mother beside her children reassured audiences that what they were witnessing was not cruelty. But Monmia knew better. She watched her daughters closely. She noticed how they flinched less, but retreated inward more. How Millie reacted sharply to sudden noise, while Christine grew quiet and watchful, her gaze drifting toward exits and corners. They spoke more now, softly, between themselves. Their language was their own, built from shared experience. They disagreed sometimes, argued in tension rather than words, two wills in one body, navigating a world that demanded they behave as one. When the tour ended, they were sent back across the Atlantic. The return to the United States was quieter, less dramatic than their departure years earlier. But the country they came back to was not the one they had left. It was a nation edging toward fracture. By the early 1860s, the air was heavy with talk of secession. States argued, borders hardened, war loomed. Millie and Christine were brought back to North Carolina, splitting time between the Smith household, brief visits with their family, and limited touring. Movement became restricted, travel less predictable. For the first time, stillness entered their lives, and with it, something unexpected: education. Despite being enslavers, the Smith household broke the law quietly. Joseph Smith's wife taught the twins to read and write, an act forbidden to enslaved people, punishable if discovered. Lessons happened in private, away from visitors and eyes. Millie and Christine absorbed knowledge quickly. Words gave shape to thoughts they had never been able to name. Reading offered escape that travel never had. Writing allowed them to record, to claim moments that could not be taken away. They learned languages. They learned music. Their voices, once irrelevant to the exhibition, began to matter. The Civil War tightened its grip on the South. Touring slowed, audiences thinned. The chaos of conflict closed some doors, but opened others, with fewer performances. The twins spent more time learning, practicing, listening. They were no longer just adapting to survive, they were preparing. When Joseph Smith died during the war, his estate, including Millie and Christine, passed to his family. But history was shifting faster than ownership could follow. By the war's end, slavery collapsed. Freedom arrived unevenly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Millie and Christine were no longer enslaved. They were teenagers now, educated, trained, experienced in ways few people their age could imagine, and for the first time. Their work was no longer something done to them alone. They toured again, but differently. They sang. Their performances changed tone. They were no longer silent curiosities. They stood before audiences as vocalists, singing duets that revealed not one voice, but two, distinct, trained, controlled. Millie took one line, Christine took another. Sometimes one carried the melody while the other followed. Sometimes they switched. The audience heard what they had never considered before. Two minds, two expressions, one shared presence. Chapter 3 ends not with escape, but with transition. Millie and Christine had been stolen, claimed, transported, recovered. They had crossed oceans and survived separation. Now, standing before audiences as singers, they stepped into something new. They were still watched, but they were also heard, and that changed everything. By the time the war reached North Carolina, Millie and Christine had already learned what instability felt like. They had lived it. Still, nothing prepared them for the way the country began to fracture. Conversations changed tone. Roads emptied. Travel became dangerous. The same towns that once welcomed crowds now braced themselves for loss. Men left. Flags changed. Fear settled into daily life. The twins were brought back to North Carolina and kept closer than before. Touring slowed, then nearly stopped. Movement, once constant, became limited by circumstance rather than choice. For the first time in their lives, Millie and Christine stayed in one place long enough for silence to feel unfamiliar. The Smith household became their primary world. It was not a place of freedom. They were still enslaved, still owned, still subject to rules they did not make. But within those walls, something quietly radical happened. They were taught to read. Joseph Smith's wife knew the risk. Teaching enslaved people literacy was illegal, dangerous not just for those taught, but for those who taught them. If discovered, punishment would be swift and unforgiving. So the lessons were hidden. They took place behind closed doors, late at night, early in the morning, in moments stolen from chaos. Words were traced slowly, letters repeated until they held meaning. Millie grasped sounds quickly. Christine lingered over structure, understanding how sentences worked. Each lesson felt like trespassing, and each lesson changed them. Reading gave Millie and Christine a way to leave the room without moving. Writing gave them something they had never had before. Record, a way to hold on to thoughts without speaking them aloud, a way to exist without being watched. They learned languages, too. Not fluently, but enough to recognize patterns, enough to feel the expansion of possibility. Music followed naturally. Their voices, once irrelevant to their existence, were trained deliberately. They practiced quietly at first, then louder. The war tightened its grip. Battles were fought far away. But consequences reached everywhere. Supplies dwindled, fear spread. The South closed in on itself. In that narrowing world, the twins continued learning. They were no longer children absorbing experience blindly. They were becoming aware. Millie questioned more openly. She challenged explanations that did not satisfy her. Christine observed, storing information, choosing carefully when to speak. Their differences sharpened, but so did their cooperation. They began to understand something fundamental. Knowledge created distance between who they were and how they were treated. Joseph Smith died during the war. The news came without ceremony. An illness, a passing, a transfer of property. His death did not change their status immediately. They remained enslaved under the Smith family, but it marked a shift. Ownership felt less solid as the war dragged on. The idea of permanence weakened everywhere. Laws bent, structures cracked. Slavery, once unquestionable, began to look fragile. When the war ended, freedom did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly. Documents were signed. Chains dissolved in theory before they did in practice. People who had lived their entire lives owned by others were told they were free, then left to figure out what that meant. Millie and Christine were among them. They were no longer enslaved. They were teenagers now, educated, trained, seasoned by years of exposure. Freedom did not erase their past. It did not remove the way the world looked at them, but it gave them something new: choice. Touring resumed, but differently. Contracts replaced commands. Payment followed performance. Their labor was still demanded, but now it came with negotiation. They sang, not as curiosities, as performers. Their duets surprised audiences. Two voices, distinct, controlled, deliberate, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes alternating, sometimes clashing slightly, then resolving. People leaned in for the sound, not just the sight. Millie felt the power of projection. Christine felt the control of timing. Together, they discovered something they had never been allowed to possess before: presence. Chapter 4 begins here, with a war that closed roads and opened minds, with a system collapsing just enough to allow two girls to step forward not as objects, but as people with voices worth hearing. They were still watched, but now they were also listened to, and that difference would shape everything that followed. Freedom did not arrive with clarity when Millie and Christine were told they were no longer enslaved. No one explained what came next. There was no map for girls who had spent their lives being owned, displayed, transported, and discussed like artifacts. Freedom existed on paper long before it took shape in reality. But one thing was certain: they were no longer silent. Education had changed the way they moved through the world. Millie read quickly, devouring text with impatience, drawn to ideas that challenged authority. Christine read carefully, returning to passages, tracing meaning with precision. Together, they argued over interpretation, tone, intent, two minds sharpening each other for the first time. Disagreement did not mean imbalance. It meant thought. Their writing became more confident. They recorded observations, emotions, fragments of memory. They wrote about crowds, about fear, about the way applause felt hollow when it followed pain. They did not yet write about resentment, but it lived beneath the words. Music transformed from practice into craft. Their voices matured, shaped by discipline rather than novelty. Millie favored projection, clear, strong, insistent. Christine favored control, measured, restrained, deliberate. When they sang together, the contrast drew attention. It was not novelty anymore. It was structure, as touring resumed. Millie and Christine no longer stood on stage in silence. They introduced themselves. They chose songs. They spoke between performances, briefly, carefully, but with intention. Audiences noticed. The twins were no longer just seen. They were understood, if only partially. People leaned in not to confirm what they already believed, but to listen for something unexpected. Managers adjusted. What had once been an exhibition now became a performance. Programs listed musical numbers. Posters emphasized talent as much as physical uniqueness. The twins' education became part of the story, not as defiance, but as refinement. Millie and Christine understood the strategy. They let it happen. They had learned enough about power to recognize that confrontation was not always effective. Influence, they realized, worked differently. It slipped in quietly. It changed expectations before anyone noticed they had shifted. Their bodies still drew attention. That would never change. But their voices altered the terms of engagement. They negotiated contracts, slowly at first, then with more confidence. They insisted on rest days, on reasonable schedules, on fair payment. Each request was met with hesitation. Then acceptance, because they were profitable, and for the first time. Profit worked in their favor. Their bond deepened. Disagreement still surfaced. Fatigue sharpened tempers, and frustration found easy targets. But they learned to listen before reacting. The cost of conflict was too high. Cooperation was not just survival anymore. It was strategy. Monmia watched this evolution with quiet pride. She saw her daughters claim space that had never been offered. She saw them speak calmly to men who once would have ignored them. She saw them assert boundaries, not loudly, but firmly. And she knew this had come from education, not just reading and writing, but understanding. The world still labeled them as curiosities. Newspapers still used language that reduced them to spectacle. But something essential had shifted. Millie and Christine were no longer passive subjects of that narrative. They were participants. Chapter 4 continued not with triumph, but with grounding, with the steady realization that autonomy did not arrive in a single moment. It was built, decision by decision, word by word, note by note. They stood on stage together now, not because they were placed there, but because they chose to be. Control did not arrive as rebellion. It arrived as familiarity. By the time Millie and Christine stepped onto stages again with regularity, they understood the mechanics of attention better than anyone in the room. They knew when an audience leaned forward, when it drifted, when it listened out of curiosity, and when it listened out of respect. They adjusted accordingly. Their performances became structured, intentional. Songs were arranged to highlight contrast, Millie's strength against Christine's restraint. One voice rose while the other anchored. The audience no longer watched simply to confirm what they saw. They stayed to hear how the two voices met and separated. For the first time, the twins set the tone. They spoke briefly before performances, not explanations, not apologies, introductions. Their words were careful but confident. They did not invite pity. They did not emphasize difference unless it served them. They framed themselves as artists. Managers noticed the shift immediately. Audiences responded differently. Applause came later, more measured, more sincere. People spoke of the twins not just as wonders, but as performers who happened to be extraordinary. The distinction mattered. With that distinction came leverage. Millie began asking questions no one had expected, about schedules, about contracts, about profit distribution. Christine listened, calculated, and refined those questions into terms. They negotiated quietly, but persistently. They insisted on limits, on fewer exhibitions per day, on accommodations that recognized the strain of their shared body. Each demand was framed reasonably, supported by logic and precedent, and because they were successful. Those demands were met. Their independence did not look dramatic from the outside. There were no headlines announcing it, no declarations of autonomy, but behind the scenes, decisions were shifting. Millie and Christine chose when to perform. They chose where to travel. They chose what parts of themselves were displayed. They could not escape curiosity. They did not try. Instead, they redirected it. Their physical connection remained visible, but it no longer defined the entire experience. It became one element among many. Their voices carried equal weight, sometimes more. Monmia watched this transformation with a quiet awe. She remembered the children who had been sold before they could walk, who had been examined, transported, and displayed without consent. Now, those same children stood before crowds and spoke calmly, firmly, as if the stage belonged to them. Because, in many ways, it did. Millie still felt anger. It surfaced unexpectedly, in sharp tones. In moments of impatience, Christine felt caution. the instinct to protect what they had built. Their differences did not disappear. They never would, but they had learned how to use them. Millie pushed boundaries. Christine stabilized them. Together, they advanced. Chapter 4 ends not with victory, but with foundation. With two young women who had survived war, exploitation, and displacement, and emerged not untouched, but aware. They were no longer carried from place to place. They walked, carefully, deliberately, into roles they had shaped themselves. Ahead lay adulthood, choice, and the complicated reality of independence in a world that still struggled to see them fully. But now, when they stepped onto a stage, it was not because someone had placed them there. It was because they had agreed, and that agreement changed everything. Adulthood did not arrive suddenly. There was no clear moment when Millie and Christine crossed a line and became something new. Instead, it settled into them slowly, like a weight they learned to carry with purpose rather than resistance. Their bodies had long since stopped being a surprise to themselves. What changed was how they inhabited them. They traveled now by choice. Not by command. Tours were planned with deliberation. Contracts were read carefully. Schedules were negotiated instead of imposed. The world still stared, but the terms of engagement had shifted. They were no longer reacting. They were deciding. Millie approached adulthood with intensity. She questioned motives, challenged assumptions, pushed conversations further than comfort allowed. She disliked euphemisms. She disliked silence even more. Years of being watched without voice had sharpened her need to speak plainly. Christine approached it differently. She measured consequences. She weighed timing. She understood that words could shape outcomes just as much as force. Where Millie pressed forward, Christine steadied the ground beneath them. Together, they balanced. Their performances reflected that balance. Music remained central, but narration began to enter the program, between songs. They spoke to audiences, not to explain themselves, but to contextualize their presence. They talked about discipline, about practice, about partnership. They did not dwell on pain, not because it did not matter, but because it no longer defined the entirety of their work. Audiences noticed. Reviews shifted tone. Where earlier accounts had lingered on anatomy, newer ones mentioned harmony, timing, intelligence. The twins were described as articulate, composed, remarkably capable. Those words mattered. With recognition came a new idea, one that had been forming quietly for years. Authorship. Millie raised it first. She spoke of writing not as confession, but as control, of telling their story before others reshaped it again. Christine considered the risks: exposure, misinterpretation, the permanence of print. They debated it often. What finally decided them was not ambition, but necessity. They had spent their lives being narrated by others, showmen, doctors, journalists. If their story was going to exist, they wanted it to exist on their terms. They began drafting together. Writing was slower than speaking. It required patience, negotiation, and agreement. Millie favored directness, urgency. Christine favored clarity, structure. Pages were revised repeatedly. Words were weighed. Some memories were included. Others were left deliberately unnamed. The act itself was transformative. For the first time, they were not performing for an audience. They were shaping meaning privately, without applause or expectation. Writing became a space where they could pause, disagree, and resolve without consequence. They were not just telling what happened, they were deciding what it meant. As adulthood settled in, so did the awareness of time. Their bodies required more care. Fatigue arrived faster. Pain lingered longer. They adapted again, adjusting schedules, limiting travel, prioritizing health in ways that had once been impossible. This, too, was agency. Monmia remained close, her role shifting from protector to witness. She saw her daughters not as children she had once tried desperately to shield, but as women directing their own lives with competence and restraint. The world had not softened, but Millie and Christine had hardened, selectively, intentionally, without losing precision or empathy. They understood that independence did not mean isolation. It meant informed connection. Chapter 5 opens here, with two women who had survived long enough to choose intention over endurance. They were still extraordinary in the eyes of others, but now, they were ordinary to themselves, and that, finally, was power. Recognition did not arrive as applause alone. It arrived as a tension that lingered, not on the body, but on the voice behind it, as Millie and Christine entered their adult years. Their reputation shifted in ways they could feel before they could name. Audiences still came out of curiosity, but they stayed for something else. Reviewers wrote longer pieces. Interviewers asked questions that required thought rather than confirmation. For the first time, people wanted to know what the twins thought. This unsettled Millie at first. She had grown accustomed to resistance, to being underestimated. Respect felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Christine understood the transition more easily. She recognized the signs of a narrative changing course and knew how fragile that moment could be. They responded carefully. Public appearances became more selective. They declined invitations that framed them as novelty alone. They accepted those that acknowledged craft, discipline, and longevity. Each decision refined their public image, not as an accident of nature, but as professionals. Their writing advanced alongside their performances. What began as drafts and fragments grew into a coherent manuscript. They did not write chronologically. Memory resisted neat order. Instead, they organized by themes, movement, silence, labor, choice. They avoided spectacle in language the same way they avoided it on stage. They were not interested in shocking the reader. They were interested in being understood. The process was not easy. Some memories resisted description. Others demanded to be softened to avoid reopening wounds. Millie pushed to include moments of anger, of resentment that had never fully faded. Christine insisted on balance, context without dilution. They argued. They revised. They compromised. What emerged was not a confession. It was a statement. When excerpts began circulating, response followed quickly. Readers commented on the clarity of voice, on the restraint, on the intelligence behind the narrative. The twins were not pleading for sympathy. They were offering perspective. That distinction changed everything. Public discourse shifted subtly. Medical journals referenced their words. Newspapers quoted them not as subjects, but as commentators. Their story began to be cited as experience, not anomaly. Millie noticed the change most clearly in conversation. Men who once spoke over her now paused. Doctors who had examined her as a child now asked permission before speaking. Christine noticed it in correspondence. The tone of letters, the phrasing of requests, the assumption of competence. Neither woman mistook this for equality. But it was movement. As their visibility increased, so did responsibility. They were aware that their story would shape how others like them were seen. They could not control interpretation, but they could influence it. They chose to emphasize autonomy. They spoke about partnership, not just between themselves, but between body and will. They framed their shared life not as tragedy or miracle, but as collaboration. Something learned, practiced, refined. Audiences struggled with that framing. It offered no easy emotion, no clear moral, but it lingered. And lingering, The twins had learned, mattered, behind the scenes. Adulthood brought quieter challenges. Their bodies demanded rest. Travel was limited. Pain management became deliberate. They scheduled performances around health rather than profit. This was not retreat. It was preservation. Christine insisted on structure. Millie insisted on honesty. Together, they built routines that respected both. Their bond matured, not romanticized, not idealized, but grounded in understanding earned through decades of shared existence. They knew each other's thresholds intimately. When one faltered, the other adjusted instinctively. This was not sacrifice. It was fluency. Chapter 5 continues here, with two women navigating recognition without surrendering control. They had learned that being seen was not the same as being known, and they were determined to decide the difference. The decision to publish was heavier than either of them expected. It was one thing to write for themselves, for clarity, for control, for the quiet satisfaction of putting experience into words. It was another to release those words into a world that had never handled them gently. Millie felt urgency. She had spent her life responding to narratives shaped by others, showmen, physicians, journalists. Each version flattened something essential. Publication, to her, was a correction, a line drawn where distortion had once stood. Christine felt responsibility. She understood that once printed, words could not be gathered back. Context could be lost. Tone misread. A sentence intended as explanation could be transformed into spectacle. They moved forward anyway. The manuscript was not marketed as tragedy. It was not framed as miracle. It was presented plainly, as an account authored by two women who had lived a life most people could not imagine, and who refused to let imagination replace truth. When it appeared, reactions were immediate and divided. Some readers searched for the familiar emotions they expected: pity, shock, inspiration. They did not always find them. The writing was restrained, measured, unwilling to perform suffering on demand. Others recognized what the twins had offered: a perspective that did not ask to be saved, a life described without apology, a body acknowledged without being reduced. Reviews noted the discipline of the prose, the clarity of voice, the unusual structure. Two minds speaking as one narrative without collapsing into a single identity. Critics struggled to categorize the work, and in that struggle, the twins found quiet satisfaction. They had not written to fit a category. They had written to exist accurately. Public conversations followed. Invitations arrived to speak, to advise, to comment. Millie accepted some, declined others. Christine filtered carefully, insisting on environments where nuance would be respected. When they spoke publicly, they spoke deliberately. They did not present themselves as symbols. They rejected the idea gently but firmly. They talked instead about labor, consent, adaptation, partnership, about the difference between being visible and being understood. They emphasized choice, not as something given freely, but as something claimed gradually, often imperfectly. Their story, they insisted, was not about overcoming a body. It was about learning to live within one honestly. That framing unsettled people. It left no room for easy admiration, no moral lesson neatly tied at the end, but it forced engagement. And engagement, the twins had learned, was the beginning of change. As years passed, the weight of representation grew more apparent. They received letters from people whose bodies marked them as different, from parents uncertain how to protect their children from a world eager to stare, from doctors reconsidering how they spoke to patients. Millie read these letters with intensity. Christine read them slowly. They discussed them late at night, considering what response was owed and what was not. They understood something now that youth had not allowed them to see clearly. They were not responsible for saving anyone, but they were responsible for honesty. That principle guided them as their public presence gradually narrowed. Performances became fewer, travel shorter, writing more reflective. They turned inward, not in retreat, but in consolidation. Their bodies aged, pain became more insistent, fatigue less forgiving. They adapted again, not as children forced to survive, but as adults choosing sustainability over endurance. Monmia aged with them, her presence constant but unobtrusive. She watched her daughters become references, quoted, cited, remembered. She saw history begin to shift around their names. Chapter 5 closes here, not with finality, but with grounding. Millie and Christine had written themselves into history not as curiosities, not as exceptions, but as authors of their own account. They had not erased what was done to them. They had contextualized it. Their legacy was not inspiration. It was accuracy, and accuracy, they understood, was the most radical thing they could leave behind. They were born in silence. On a cold morning in May 1934, in a small farmhouse near Corbeil, Ontario, 5 premature girls entered the world one after another, each weighing barely more than a loaf of bread. Their parents, Oliva and Elzire Dion, had no time to understand what was happening. There was no celebration, only urgency. Doctors moved quickly, hands shook, breath was held, against every expectation of the time. All 5 survived. The names came later. Yvonne, Annette, Cécile, Émilie, Marie. By the end of the week, they were already famous. News traveled faster than medicine. Newspapers announced the miracle. Radio broadcasts carried the story across borders. In the middle of the Great Depression, when hope was scarce and survival uncertain, 5 tiny lives became proof that something extraordinary could still happen. The world leaned in, at first. The attention felt protective. Doctors spoke of care. Officials spoke of responsibility. The parents were overwhelmed, unprepared, and poor. They had no language for contracts, no shield against interest disguised as concern. Within months, the government of Ontario intervened. They said it was temporary. They said it was necessary. They said it was for the children's own good. The Dion quintuplets were removed from their family and placed under state guardianship. A special compound was built for them, sterile, controlled, efficient. It was called Quintland. Glass walls separated the children from the world and from their parents every day. Crowds arrived, thousands of people lined up, paid admission, and watched the girls through one-way windows as they played, slept, and ate. The children did not understand why they were always being observed. They only knew that eyes never left them. Doctors monitored everything: weight, height, behavior. Movements were recorded, habits documented. Their lives became data. It was called protection. It was called science. It was called progress behind the glass. The girls grew up together, but not freely. Playtime was scheduled, interaction regulated. Their bond was encouraged, but their individuality was not. They were presented as a unit, a set, a phenomenon. Dolls were made in their likeness. Products carried their names. Millions of dollars flowed through the gates of Quintland. None of it reached the children. They did not see the crowds. They heard them, distant, constant, like weather that never cleared. They learned to ignore it, or tried to. Émilie, the quietest, clung to routines. Annette watched everything. Yvonne followed rules instinctively. Cécile adapted quickly. Marie lingered behind, sensitive to noise, 5 girls, 1 childhood, observed. Their parents watched from the other side of the fence. Oliva and Elzire were allowed limited visits. Supervised, timed. They stood outside the glass like strangers, watching their own children perform normalcy for an audience that paid to witness it. The justification never changed. This is for their safety. This is for their future. But safety had become a stage, and childhood had become a spectacle. Chapter 6 opens not with chains, but with glass. Not with ownership, but with guardianship. The language had evolved. The outcome had not. 5 sisters grew up protected from poverty and stripped of privacy. They survived. But survival, history would learn again, was not the same as care. Quintland did not announce itself as a spectacle. It announced itself as a solution. Officials described it as a sanctuary, a place designed to shield 5 fragile children from a world that would otherwise overwhelm them. The buildings were clean, the routines precise. Doctors and nurses were always present. On paper, everything appeared careful, even compassionate. But compassion began to look different once the gates opened. Each morning, crowds gathered early. Families arrived with packed lunches. Tourists lined up, paid their admission, and waited their turn. Signs directed them where to stand, when to move, where not to look too long. Behind the glass, the Dion quintuplets lived their days on display. They played with carefully chosen toys. They ate at scheduled times. They napped when instructed. Their laughter, when it came, was unplanned. But never private. Every gesture was visible, every habit observed. The glass walls were one way. The girls could not see the faces watching them. They could only feel the presence, an invisible pressure that never left, a sense that something was always happening just beyond their reach. Doctors recorded everything. Growth charts were updated daily. Behavioral notes were written in neat handwriting. Differences between the girls were tracked, compared, analyzed. They were studied not as individuals, but as a set, 5 variations of the same miracle. The language was clinical. The effect was not. As Quintland's popularity grew, so did its infrastructure. More viewing areas were added. Souvenir stands appeared outside the gates. Postcards, dolls, cups, and calendars carried the girls' faces. Their names became brands. Millions of dollars flowed through Quintland. None of it reached the children. The justification remained consistent. This money is for their future. This is an investment in their protection, inside. The girls learned routine before they learned choice. They learned how to line up, how to share without deciding, how to speak softly when told. Their bond was reinforced, but their separateness was blurred. They were praised for acting alike, corrected when they differed. Individuality was inefficient. Emily struggled most, sensitive and quiet. She withdrew into herself, finding comfort in repetition. Annette watched everything closely, storing observations without comment. Yvonne followed rules as if they were laws of nature. Cecile adapted easily, learning how to please adults. Marie, often overlooked, absorbed tension like a sponge. 5 children, 5 responses, 1 system. Their parents remained on the outside. Oliva and Elzire Dion were permitted visits, but always supervised, always brief. They stood in designated areas, watched their daughters through glass like everyone else. Their attempts to reclaim authority were dismissed gently, then firmly. They were told they were unprepared, that they lacked resources, that experts knew better. The distance between protection and ownership narrowed as years passed. Quintland became a symbol. Politicians praised it. Newspapers celebrated it. It was cited as a triumph of modern governance, a model of how science and state power could safeguard the vulnerable. No one asked the children how it felt. The girls grew accustomed to being watched, but not to being known. They learned early that emotions were safest when kept small. That privacy was something other people had, at night, when the crowds were gone. The glass still remained. Silence did not feel empty. It felt expectant. Chapter 6 continues here, with 5 sisters growing up under observation, protected from hunger and exposure, yet deprived of something harder to quantify: choice. They were safe, they were famous, and they were learning, slowly and quietly, that the world could take everything it wanted while insisting it was acting in their best interest. When the gates of Quintland finally opened, it was not because the world had changed its mind, it was because the girls had grown up. By the early 1940s, public fascination had begun to fade. The novelty that once drew millions no longer guaranteed endless lines. The state's justification weakened as the girls approached adolescence, quietly, without ceremony. A decision was made. The Dion quintuplets would be returned to their family. A large house was built for them, paid for with the money earned in their name. It stood close to their parents' home, solid and imposing, meant to represent restitution. Newspapers called it a happy ending. Officials framed it as reunion. For the girls, it felt like relocation. They stepped into a house filled with people they recognized only by memory. Their parents were familiar faces, but not familiar presences. Years of supervised visits had not prepared either side for daily life together. The girls did not know how to be daughters. Their parents did not know how to be parents to children who had grown up behind glass. Rules clashed immediately. At Quintland, everything had been scheduled. At home, discipline arrived unpredictably. Affection, when offered, came unevenly. The girls were expected to be grateful, to understand that sacrifice had been made on their behalf. They did not know how. Their father, Oliva, struggled most. He had watched his children become famous while remaining powerless. Resentment mixed with pride. Control replaced protection. What the state had done with paperwork, he attempted to do with authority. The house that was meant to heal instead magnified distance. The girls retreated inward. Annette observed the shift quickly, recognizing danger in unpredictability. Yvonne complied outwardly, preserving order where she could. Cécile adapted again, learning new rules as she always had. Marie became quieter, shrinking away from conflict. Émilie, fragile and sensitive, deteriorated visibly. The glass was gone. The surveillance was not. Expectations followed them everywhere. How they spoke, how they behaved, what they owed. They were no longer objects of public curiosity, but they were still treated as assets. Their childhood had been profitable. Their adolescence was expected to justify it. No one asked what they wanted. As they grew older, fractures appeared. Emily struggled with epilepsy and emotional distress. The routines that had once stabilized her were gone. Without them, her health declined. She entered a convent seeking structure and quiet, but it was not enough. She died at 20, alone. The others carried the loss differently. Annette sought distance, eventually leaving home. Yvonne pursued a quieter life, guarded and private. Cécile oscillated between connection and withdrawal. Marie, always the most sensitive to noise, never fully escaped the echo of being watched. In adulthood, the truth surfaced slowly. The money earned by Quintland had been mismanaged, trust funds depleted, promises broken. The girls discovered that much of what had been saved for their future was gone. They sued the government. The case forced the public to confront what had long been avoided. Documents were examined, decisions questioned. The language of protection was exposed for what it had been. Justification. The settlement came years later. It did not restore what was taken, but it acknowledged something essential. They had been exploited. Chapter 6 ends here, not with closure, but with reckoning. 5 sisters survived fame, isolation, and return. They were protected from poverty, but not from harm. Their childhood was preserved in photographs and erased in practice. They had been raised as a unit. They lived the consequences as individuals. The glass had shattered. What remained were lives shaped by attention they never chose, and a world slowly learning that good intentions do not excuse damage. They were born into privilege, not the kind that had to be earned or defended or even understood, but the kind that existed simply by name. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes Lyon entered the world surrounded by lineage, titles, and quiet assumptions of protection. Their family tree reached directly into the British royal household. They were cousins of Queen Elizabeth II. From the outside, their lives should have been untouchable. They were not. From an early age, it became clear that Nerissa and Catherine developed differently from the children around them. Their speech was delayed. Their understanding of the world did not follow expected timelines. They learned slowly, carefully, in ways that unsettled a family accustomed to polish and presentation in another household. This difference might have prompted patience, accommodation, care in theirs. It prompted fear. The early 20th century was not kind to intellectual disability, especially within families whose public image depended on perfection. Difference was not discussed openly. It was hidden, managed, reframed, or removed. When Nerissa was in her early 20s and Catherine still a teenager, a decision was made quietly, decisively. They were sent to Royal Earlswood Hospital, an institution for people with intellectual disabilities. The paperwork was efficient. The language was clinical. The silence afterward was complete. In official family records, both women were listed as deceased. No funeral, no announcement, no correction. They were alive, inside the hospital. Time moved differently. Days were repetitive. Years passed without markers. Nerissa and Catherine lived among hundreds of others, many abandoned by families who had learned how to disappear. They were not mistreated in overt ways, but neither were they cherished. They existed in a system designed to contain, not nurture. Clothing was functional, routines inflexible. Identity slowly eroded under institutional sameness. They did not know who they were related to. They did not know what had been written about them. They only knew the shape of their days. Nerissa was gentle, affectionate, easily excited by small kindnesses. Catherine was quieter, more withdrawn. Her expressions often unreadable to those who did not try hard enough. They recognized visitors, not by faces, but by energy. And visitors were rare. The royal family never came. Decades passed. World wars were fought. Monarchs changed. The empire shrank. And still, Nerissa and Catherine remained where they had been placed, aging quietly. Unseen, when staff members occasionally mentioned the royal family, it was not in connection to them. The idea that 2 women living in an institution could be related to the Queen felt implausible, unreal. It was easier to believe the paperwork. Nerissa died in 1986. She was 66 years old. Her grave was marked with a plastic tag and a number. No family attended the burial. Catherine lived on for several more years, still unaware that her sister had been erased not just from life, but from history. When she died in 2014, the silence surrounding her life finally began to fracture. Journalists uncovered the truth, the records, the falsified deaths, the decades of omission. Public reaction was stunned, then uncomfortable. How could such a thing happen within a family so closely associated with duty, tradition, and care? The answer was simpler than many wanted to admit. Silence is easier than reckoning. Chapter 7 begins here, not with crowds or glass or applause, but with absence. Two sisters were not exploited for spectacle. They were erased to preserve an image. Their lives unfolded in quiet rooms, far from cameras, far from curiosity. And yet, the damage was no less profound. They were not hidden because they were dangerous. They were hidden because they challenged the illusion of perfection. Royal Earlswood Hospital did not look like a place of punishment. From the outside, it resembled many institutions of its time. Brick buildings, trimmed grounds, orderly paths. It was designed to reassure, to suggest stability, to convince families that what happened inside was necessary, even humane. For Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, it became the world inside. Life followed strict patterns. Wake, eat, sit, walk, sleep. Days were not marked by events, but by repetition. Identity softened over time, worn down not by cruelty, but by absence of choice, absence of attention, absence of belonging. They were known by first names only, sometimes not even that. Records reduced them to diagnoses. Assessments were written in detached language, measuring capacity without acknowledging personhood. Intelligence was quantified, behavior categorized, emotional life ignored. This was considered progress. For families like the Bowes-Lyon, institutions offered something else entirely: distance. Difference could be removed from daily life and sealed behind professional authority. Once placed, silence was expected, and silence was kept. Nerissa and Catherine did not receive letters. No birthday cards arrived. No one asked about their health. Over time, even staff stopped expecting visitors for them. They became fixtures, always there, never claimed. The world beyond the gates moved forward without them. Televisions appeared in common rooms. Newspapers came and went. The monarchy changed. Elizabeth became queen. Ceremonies filled screens. Faces appeared familiar. Though no connection was made, no one told them. Their royal lineage was erased not only from public record, but from their own understanding of self. They were not told they belonged anywhere else. They were not told they were missed. That omission was not accidental at the time. Intellectual disability was viewed as hereditary contamination, something that threatened bloodlines and reputations. For aristocratic families, the stakes were higher. Acknowledging difference meant inviting scrutiny. Silence preserved dignity. At least, that was the belief. Care, in this context, became indistinguishable from concealment. Nerissa responded to the world with openness. She greeted staff warmly. She sought touch and reassurance. Her joy was unguarded, easily sparked by kindness, but easily overlooked. Catherine withdrew further inward. She spoke little. She learned to exist without expectation. Her stillness was often mistaken for absence. They relied on each other, sisters by blood. They became sisters by necessity. Their bond was not nurtured by shared memories of family life, but by shared abandonment. They recognized each other as constant when everything else remained uncertain. Years passed unnoticed. Funding changed. Policies shifted. Institutions grew more crowded, then slowly began to empty as reform movements gained traction. Patients were transferred. Wards reorganized. Still, Nerissa and Catherine remained. When Nerissa died in 1986, the event passed without ceremony. The documentation was minimal. Her grave was unmarked by name, marked instead by a number, efficient, anonymous. Final. Catherine was not informed. In institutional life, death did not always warrant explanation. Absence was simply absorbed into routine. One less person at the table, one less body in a bed. Catherine lived on alone, unaware that her sister had been buried without acknowledgement. It was not until years later, after reforms, after investigations, after a changing public conscience, that questions surfaced. Journalists uncovered inconsistencies. Family trees were examined. Names thought long dead were found alive in institutional records. The revelation shocked the public. How could two women so closely related to the Queen have lived and died this way? The question was asked loudly. The answer, when it came, was quiet. No laws had been broken, no abuse documented, no single decision could be blamed. This was not cruelty by action, it was cruelty by erasure. Chapter 7 continues here, with two sisters whose lives were shaped not by spectacle, but by deliberate forgetting. They were hidden not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. Silence did not protect them. It protected the image of those who left them behind. The truth did not emerge all at once. It surfaced in fragments, misfiled dates, inconsistencies in family records, a name that appeared where it should not have. Journalists, tracing genealogies tied to the royal family, noticed something that refused to align. Two women listed as dead decades earlier were not buried where the records claimed. They had never been buried at all. Instead, they had been alive, living quietly inside an institution few outside its walls ever questioned. When the story of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon became public in the late 20th century, reaction was immediate and uneasy. Headlines carried disbelief. Commentators spoke of betrayal, of hypocrisy, of cruelty hidden beneath ceremony and tradition. How could this happen? How could two women, blood relatives of the Queen, be written out of existence while still breathing? The answer unsettled precisely because it lacked drama. There was no villain, no scandalous abuse, no moment of explosive wrongdoing. There was only consent to forget. Family members issued statements expressing sadness, distance, confusion. They spoke of different times, different understandings, different standards of care. They insisted the decision had been made with concern, not shame. Perhaps that was true, but concern without presence is still abandonment. By the time the truth reached the public, Nerissa was already gone, buried beneath a plastic marker. Her name absent even in death. Catherine remained alive, elderly, frail, and unaware that the world was finally speaking her name. She would never be asked how she felt. No interview followed, no apology reached her directly, no ceremony restored what had been taken. The recognition arrived too late to matter where it counted. For the public, the story became a moment of reckoning. Institutions were questioned. Families reconsidered histories long accepted without examination. The language of care, once unquestioned, was reevaluated. What does protection mean if it requires erasure? What does dignity mean if it depends on silence? For Catherine, life continued as it always had, quiet, contained, shaped by routine rather than recognition. She lived until 2014, long enough to see a world that had changed its words, if not always its actions. She died without spectacle, and perhaps that was fitting. Chapter 7 closes not with justice, but with exposure. Two sisters were not exploited for attention, nor protected with compassion. They were removed to preserve an image that could not tolerate imperfection. Their lives were not tragic because they were disabled. They were tragic because they were discarded. Silence was the tool. Respectability was the excuse. Time did the rest. Their story forces a difficult truth into the open. Harm does not always look violent. Sometimes it looks like forgetting in Renaissance Italy. Daughters were not born. They were placed into ledgers, placed into negotiations, placed into futures that had already been decided for the Medici family. Power was not inherited quietly. It was constructed through money, influence, and marriages that functioned like treaties. Sons extended the name, daughters secured it, love was irrelevant, consent unnecessary. From childhood, Medici girls were taught the language of obedience. They learned how to stand, how to speak, how to remain still while men decided the direction of their lives. Education was permitted, but only insofar as it made them more presentable, more convincing, more useful. They were groomed not to rule, but to stabilize rule within palace walls. They lived surrounded by art, luxury, and ritual. But comfort did not equal agency. Their days were governed by expectation, not curiosity. Their bodies were guarded, their reputations monitored. A daughter's value lay in her potential alliance. To be married was not a personal milestone. It was a political transaction among the Medici daughters. Several names were remembered only briefly, often because they died young, quietly, without altering the course of history. Their deaths were recorded as footnotes, their lives rarely discussed. One such child was Bea de' Medici. Bea did not live long enough to be married. She died in early childhood, likely from illness. Before her usefulness could be assessed, her death was mourned privately, then absorbed into the rhythm of court life. The state moved on. Others followed. Anna de' Medici and Maria de' Medici, sisters born into the same expectations, met similar ends. Childhood illnesses claimed them before they could be bartered. Their brief lives mattered emotionally, but not politically. They were remembered as losses, not as individuals. The Medici household did not slow its ambitions for grief. Girls who survived childhood were shaped with urgency. They were instructed in piety, decorum, silence. Their futures were spoken of in rooms they were not allowed to enter. Marriages were arranged with men far older, often unknown to them, chosen for geography and influence rather than compatibility. For a Medici daughter, adulthood arrived not with independence, but with transfer. She moved from her father's control to her husband's. The most famous among them, Lucrezia de' Medici, was married at 13 to Alfonso II d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. The match was celebrated publicly, praised as a triumph of diplomacy. Privately, it was a sentence. Lucrezia entered a court where she was watched constantly, evaluated for obedience and fertility. Her health declined rapidly. Rumors circulated, whispers of neglect, of cruelty, of poisoning. At 16, she was dead. Officially, she died of illness. Unofficially, history has never stopped asking questions. The Medici response was swift and contained. The alliance had failed. Damage control followed. Lucrezia's body was buried. Her story closed. Another daughter, Isabella de' Medici, lived longer, but her fate was no less controlled. Isabella was intelligent, articulate, and dangerously independent. Married to Paolo Giordano Orsini, a union meant to strengthen Medici influence in Rome. She entered a marriage defined by suspicion and violence. Her independence was interpreted as threat. In 1576, Isabella was found dead at her villa. The official cause was sudden illness. The truth was known. She had been murdered, strangled on her husband's orders. With her family's silent consent, her behavior had embarrassed the alliance. Her death restored balance. No trial followed. No justice was sought. Her body was interred. Her name remained, but her voice did not. Chapter 8 begins here, with sisters born into wealth and culture, yet denied autonomy. Their lives were shaped by contracts they never signed and ended by decisions made in the name of stability. They were not hidden. They were used, and when they no longer served a purpose, they were erased, politely, efficiently, and forever, in the courts of Renaissance Italy. Marriage was not a bond, it was a mechanism. For families like the Medici, a daughter's wedding marked the moment when her body, her conduct, and her future were formally transferred. Vows were spoken in public, contracts were signed in private. What mattered was not affection, but outcome. A successful marriage produced heirs. A failed one produced instability, and instability was intolerable. Medici daughters learned this early. They watched older sisters leave the palace and never return. They heard whispers of distant courts, cold husbands, and rules that tightened rather than loosened with marriage. They were taught to endure. Endurance was praised as virtue to survive marriage. A woman needed restraint, of speech, of desire, of opinion. Independence was interpreted as provocation. Intelligence, if not carefully masked, was dangerous. Those who adapted lived longer. Those who did not were corrected. Isabella de' Medici understood the rules better than most, and broke them anyway. Educated, eloquent, and keenly aware of her position. She refused to disappear into obedience. She corresponded widely. She hosted salons. She made her presence felt in a court that preferred its women decorative and silent. Her husband, Paolo Giordano Orsini, saw this not as brilliance, but as threat in aristocratic marriages. Suspicion was not unusual. What distinguished Isabella's fate was not jealousy alone, but permission. Her independence embarrassed alliances. It invited scrutiny. It destabilized appearances. When Isabella was killed, it was not an impulsive act. It was a decision. Her death was framed as illness. The explanation was accepted. The alliance remained intact. The Medici family did not contest the narrative. They understood the rules as clearly as her husband did. Other daughters took note. Survival meant compliance, for those who resisted marriage entirely. There was another path, one that appeared gentler, but was no less final: the convent. Girls deemed unsuitable for marriage, too willful, too fragile, too politically inconvenient, were quietly removed from negotiation and placed behind walls of devotion. The convent offered safety from marriage, but not freedom. It replaced one form of obedience with another. Vows were taken, silence enforced, ambition redirected toward prayer. Families called it mercy for the women inside. It was containment. Within Medici circles, convents functioned as holding spaces for daughters whose existence complicated alliances. Their lives were preserved, but narrowed. They were not killed, but they were removed from influence. Choice did not exist. A Medici daughter could be married, secluded, or eliminated. There was no fourth option. The system endured because it worked. Alliances held. Power remained stable. Individual lives were considered acceptable losses in service of continuity. History recorded victories. It did not record consent. As generations passed, the pattern repeated. Daughters entered the world already indebted to futures they would never choose. Some adapted fully, disappearing into roles assigned to them. Others resisted and paid. Chapter 8 continues here, exposing a truth often softened by art and myth. Behind the splendor of Renaissance courts lay a machinery that consumed women quietly, efficiently, and with moral certainty. They were celebrated as symbols. They were sacrificed as people. What awaited them was not cruelty without reason, but cruelty justified as necessity. And necessity, history would learn again and again, is the most persuasive excuse of all in the world of dynasties. Death was not always failure. Sometimes it was resolution for families like the Medici, whose power depended on stability above all else. Disorder could not be allowed to linger. A daughter who threatened alliances, invited rumor, or disrupted appearances posed a risk that had to be managed. If marriage failed to contain her, and the convent failed to erase her influence, there remained one final solution. It was never spoken of openly. It did not require public justification. It only required agreement. The deaths of Medici daughters were framed carefully. Illness, weakness, fate. Physicians supplied explanations. Priests supplied prayers. Chroniclers recorded only what preserved dignity. The machinery of power closed ranks, and silence did the rest. Lucrezia de' Medici's death followed this pattern perfectly. Married at 13, isolated in a hostile court. Her health declined rapidly. She was young, fragile, and politically expendable. When she died at 16, official accounts cited illness. No investigation followed. No questions were encouraged. Her death resolved a failed alliance. The Medici moved on. Isabella de' Medici's case was more explicit, and therefore more dangerous. She was not weak. She was not quiet. She was not compliant. Her intelligence and independence drew attention in ways that could not be managed discreetly. Her husband's violence was not an aberration. It was a correction endorsed by the system that had placed her there. Her murder restored order. The Medici family accepted the outcome without protest. They understood that public outrage would damage alliances more than a daughter's death ever could. Silence was the price of continuity, and silence was paid. This was not unique to the Medici. Across Europe, aristocratic daughters lived under the same unspoken rule. Their worth lay in how smoothly they upheld the structure around them. When they failed, through illness, resistance, or mere inconvenience, they were removed, and history adjusted accordingly. Their names remained. Their stories did not. Art preserved their faces. Records preserved their dowries. Memory preserved nothing uncomfortable. What survived was an illusion that these women lived privileged lives, surrounded by beauty and power, that their deaths were unfortunate but natural, that the system itself was orderly and just. It was neither. The silence that followed their deaths was not absence. It was maintenance. By refusing to speak of what happened, families reinforced the legitimacy of their power. By framing loss as inevitability, they absolved themselves of responsibility. The dead could not contradict the narrative, and so the pattern endured. Daughters continued to be born into futures they did not choose. Alliances continued to be secured through bodies and obedience. Death continued to function as a tool, not of rage, but of governance. Chapter 8 ends here, with the recognition that cruelty does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives dressed as tradition. Sometimes it speaks the language of necessity, and sometimes it leaves behind portraits and titles, while burying the truth beneath them. The Medici daughters were not forgotten because they were insignificant. They were forgotten because remembering them honestly would have revealed how power actually worked. Their silence was not accidental. It was designed at first glance. Their lives do not belong together. Millie and Christine McCoy were born into slavery in 19th century America. The Dion quintuplets entered the world under glass in 20th century Canada. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were erased quietly inside a British institution. The Medici daughters lived and died within Renaissance courts. Different centuries, different continents, different languages, and yet the shape of their lives follows the same curve. Each story begins with birth, not as arrival, but as assignment. from the moment they entered the world. Their value was assessed not by who they were, but by what they represented: curiosity, hope, stability, power, image. None of them were asked. What linked these sisters was not tragedy alone, it was utility. Each was made useful to a system larger than herself. That system differed in name: slavery, science, guardianship, dynasty. But its logic remained intact: control disguised as care, silence framed as dignity, sacrifice justified as necessity. Millie and Christine were exhibited because their bodies drew attention. Their difference became commodity. Survival depended on adaptation, not protection. When they learned to sing, to write, to speak, it was not because the system changed, but because they found space within it. The Dion quintuplets were taken because they inspired hope. Their survival offered comfort during economic collapse. The state claimed them in the name of protection, but turned childhood into spectacle. Their lives were preserved physically, while autonomy was quietly stripped away. Nerissa and Catherine were hidden because they threatened an image. Their existence complicated the story of perfection, so they were removed, not violently, but thoroughly. Their silence was maintained for decades. Upheld by paperwork and indifference, the Medici daughters were married, confined, or killed because they stabilized power. Their bodies were instruments of alliance. Their deaths were acceptable costs in service of continuity. In each case, harm did not require hatred. It required agreement. Agreement that some lives could be shaped without consent. Agreement that certain people existed for the benefit of others. Agreement that order mattered more than individual cost. What changed across time was not the principle, but the language. In one era, it was ownership; in another, guardianship; in another, tradition; in another, medicine. The mechanism evolved. The outcome remained. These sisters were not powerless in the same ways. Some resisted openly. Some adapted quietly. Some never had the chance to do either. But all were positioned inside systems that limited their choices before they could name them. History often treats such stories as exceptions, curiosities, scandals, tragedies. But when placed side by side, they stop looking exceptional. They look structural. The same questions surface again and again. Who decides what protection looks like? Who benefits from silence? Who is allowed to speak? And when? And perhaps most importantly, who is remembered as human, and who is remembered only as symbol? Millie and Christine survived long enough to answer some of these questions themselves. The others did not. Their stories were told for them, shaped by institutions, families, and states that claimed authority without accountability. Chapter 9 opens here, not to equalize suffering, but to expose repetition, to show that these were not isolated failures of compassion, but consistent outcomes of systems designed to prioritize order over consent. Across centuries, sisters were placed where they were useful and left there when they were not. Different names, same logic. And once that logic is seen clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee. History often mistakes survival for approval. When someone endures a system, lives within it, adapts to it, even succeeds by its standards, there is a temptation to call the outcome acceptable, to say the system worked, to argue that harm must not have been so severe, because life continued. This is one of the most persistent distortions in how stories like these are remembered. Millie and Christine survived exhibition. They learned to sing. They negotiated contracts. They published their own words. From a distance, their story can be framed as triumph, proof that talent and resilience overcome injustice. But survival was not a gift of the system. It was an act against it. Every skill they developed was born from necessity, not opportunity. Their cooperation was forged by pain. Their autonomy emerged slowly, through leverage and endurance, not protection. The world did not make space for them. They carved it out with what little control they could claim. The Dion quintuplets survived Quintland physically. They were fed, housed, monitored, and protected from disease, from the outside. This looked like care, but survival came at the cost of agency. Childhood was replaced by observation, privacy by routine, family by authority. When they later struggled, emotionally, financially, psychologically, those struggles were often framed as personal failure rather than predictable consequence. Nerissa and Catherine survived institutionalization for decades. They were not beaten. They were not starved. And because of that, the harm they endured was minimized. Silence was interpreted as neutrality. Lack of protest as lack of pain. But survival inside erasure is not well-being. It is containment. The Medici daughters who lived longest did so by complying, by learning when to remain quiet, by aligning their behavior with expectation. Those who resisted did not survive. Those who adapted disappeared into roles that history barely recorded. Adaptation, in these cases, was not freedom, it was strategy. Resistance, too, is often misunderstood. It does not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like negotiation. Sometimes it looks like compliance with limits carefully tested. Sometimes it looks like silence chosen rather than imposed. Millie and Christine resisted by redefining their value, by shifting attention from anatomy to voice, by insisting on contracts, rest, authorship. Their resistance was incremental and costly. The Dion sisters resisted in quieter ways, in private bonds, in emotional withdrawal, in eventual lawsuits that forced the state to acknowledge wrongdoing decades later. Their resistance arrived late, not because they lacked awareness, but because power delayed consequence. Nerissa and Catherine had almost no space to resist. Their lives were structured to erase choice entirely. Their resistance, if it existed, was internal, held in gestures no one recorded. History rarely counts that as resistance at all. What connects these stories is not the presence or absence of defiance, but the cost of adaptation. Survival demanded adjustment to conditions no one consented to. The longer the adjustment lasted, the more invisible the harm became. Systems rely on this invisibility. They point to survival as proof of success. They point to adaptation as evidence of care. They point to time passed as absolution. But time does not heal what was never acknowledged. Chapter 9 continues here, with the recognition that endurance is not endorsement, that lives lived under constraint do not validate the constraints themselves, and that resilience, while admirable, should never be required to justify harm. Survival is not consent, and remembering these sisters accurately requires refusing that confusion. Recognition is not resolution. Seeing the pattern does not undo the harm that created it. It does not return childhoods, restore agency, or correct the years spent under glass, behind walls, or inside marriages chosen by others. What it does is remove innocence from forgetting. Once the pattern is named, silence becomes a decision for centuries. The stories of these sisters were treated as isolated events, oddities of history, unfortunate exceptions, tragedies belonging to another time. Each narrative was contained within its own context, softened by distance, explained away by circumstance, but when placed together, they formed something harder to dismiss, a structure. That structure does not depend on cruelty alone. It depends on permission, permission to decide for others, permission to define care without consent, permission to treat lives as means rather than ends. What changes across eras is not the logic, but the justification. Slavery gave way to science, science gave way to guardianship, guardianship gave way to tradition, tradition gave way to reputation. Each claimed moral authority, each insisted it knew better, each demanded trust, and each left behind lives that bore the cost of that certainty. The question, then, is not whether the past was wrong. The question is what remains once we admit it was. Responsibility does not always mean punishment. In many cases, there is no one left to hold accountable. Institutions have rebranded, families have rewritten histories, time has outpaced consequence, but responsibility does mean accuracy. It means refusing to romanticize endurance. It means resisting narratives that frame harm as inevitability. It means telling these stories without spectacle, without pity, and without justification. Millie and Christine understood this in their writing. They did not ask to be admired. They asked to be read carefully. The Dion quintuplets asked not for fame to be erased, but for its cost to be acknowledged. Nerissa and Catherine cannot ask, but their story demands that we question how many others were hidden just as quietly. The Medici daughters remind us that power has long relied on women's silence, and that elegance often masks coercion. Remembering these sisters accurately is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of resistance, because remembrance shapes expectation, and expectation shapes policy, and policy shapes lives. When we tell these stories as anomalies, we allow the structure to persist. When we tell them as patterns, we force confrontation with the systems that produce them. The danger is not that history will repeat itself exactly. The danger is that it will repeat itself under new names. Modern language has grown more careful. Institutions speak of safeguarding, best interests, dignity, support, and often, those words are genuine, but they still carry power, and power still requires scrutiny. Who decides what protection looks like? Who benefits from the arrangement? Who bears the cost if it fails? These questions do not belong only to the past. Chapter 9 ends here, with recognition as obligation. To see the pattern is to inherit responsibility for what follows. Silence is no longer neutral once understanding exists. The sisters in these stories lived different lives. Some spoke, some adapted, some were erased, none were asked. What they leave behind is not a lesson in suffering, but a demand for honesty. To remember them is not to mourn endlessly. It is to refuse to look away when care becomes control. When silence is framed as kindness, and when survival is mistaken for consent, once seen, the pattern cannot be unseen. What we do with that knowledge remains a choice. The distance between then and now feels reassuring. We like to believe that the stories of these sisters belong to a closed chapter of history, an era before rights were articulated clearly, before language evolved, before institutions learned restraint. We prefer to think that harm required ignorance, and that knowledge cured it. But harm has never depended solely on ignorance. It has depended on certainty. Certainty that authority knows best. Certainty that protection justifies intrusion. Certainty that outcomes matter more than consent. What has changed is not the temptation to control, but the vocabulary used to defend it. Today, we speak fluently about safeguarding, ethics, representation. We document intent. We convene committees. We promise transparency, and often, these efforts are sincere, but sincerity does not eliminate imbalance. The sisters in these stories were harmed not because no one cared, but because too many people believed care gave them permission to decide. Listening, then, becomes the central question. Not listening as performance, not listening as validation seeking, but listening that accepts discomfort, complexity, and limits. Millie and Christine demanded this kind of listening. They did not dramatize their suffering. They contextualized it. They refused to simplify their lives into inspiration or tragedy. They asked readers to sit with contradiction, to recognize both adaptation and harm without collapsing one into the other. The Dion quintuplets were denied that listening for decades. Their lives were explained endlessly by others, doctors, politicians, journalists, until their own voices were nearly lost. When they finally spoke through lawsuits and testimony, the public was forced to confront a truth it had long avoided. Protection without consent is still control. Nerissa and Catherine were never listened to at all. Decisions were made in rooms they never entered. Silence stood in for dignity. Their absence was mistaken for peace. The Medici daughters lived in a world where listening to women was not considered governance. Obedience was the only language that mattered. Anything else was treated as threat. What connects these stories is not cruelty alone, but failure of attention. Attention that asks before acting. Attention that distinguishes care from ownership. Attention that knows when to stop. In the present, we are surrounded by stories of disability, difference, trauma, vulnerability, shared publicly, amplified widely. Visibility is often treated as progress, and sometimes it is, but visibility without restraint repeats old patterns. The question is no longer whether we can see, it is whether we can see without taking. Can we engage without consuming? Can we support without controlling? Can we protect without erasing agency? These questions are not rhetorical. They shape policy, medicine, media, family life. They shape how children are raised, how bodies are discussed, how stories are told. Chapter 10 opens here, with listening as practice rather than gesture. With the recognition that remembering these sisters is not about honoring suffering, but about changing response. Their lives ask us to reconsider what we mean when we say for their own good. They ask us to slow down, to ask consent before curiosity, to allow complexity without resolution. They do not offer redemption. They offer responsibility. And responsibility, unlike pity, requires action. Memory is not neutral. It can heal, but it can also repeat harm, especially when stories are told without restraint. When lives marked by vulnerability are remembered only for what they represent, rather than who they were, memory becomes another form of extraction. This is the risk these sisters leave us with. Millie and Christine were remembered for decades as curiosities before they were recognized as authors. The Dion quintuplets were preserved in photographs and merchandise long after their voices were ignored. Nerissa and Catherine were absent from memory entirely, erased so completely that their existence became an inconvenience. The Medici daughters survived in portraits, faces without context, beauty without biography. In each case, remembrance favored image over agency. To remember responsibly, then, requires discipline. It means resisting the urge to simplify. It means refusing to turn endurance into inspiration. It means allowing discomfort to remain unresolved. Stories like these are often framed to provoke reaction, shock, sadness, admiration, but reaction is not understanding. Understanding requires patience, and patience is rarely rewarded in public discourse. The easiest version of these stories centers the audience. What did we feel? What did we learn? The harder version centers the subject. What did they lose? What did they never get to choose? Responsible memory asks different questions. What systems enabled this? Who benefited from silence? How did justification replace consent? And crucially, how do we tell these stories now without recreating the imbalance that shaped them? There is a difference between bearing witness and taking ownership of another person's pain. Bearing witness accepts limits. It does not demand access to every detail. It does not require closure. Millie and Christine understood this boundary. Their writing was precise, selective. They chose what to reveal and what to withhold. They refused to perform intimacy for validation. That refusal is instructive. To honor lives like theirs, and the lives of the sisters who never had the chance to speak, means allowing absence to remain where it belongs. Not every silence needs interpretation. Not every gap needs filling. Some truths are carried, not displayed, in practice. This changes how stories are shared. It means foregrounding context over spectacle. It means naming systems rather than isolating individuals. It means asking who controls the narrative and why. Memory becomes ethical when it shifts focus away from fascination and toward accountability. This does not mean forgetting. It means remembering with restraint. The sisters in these stories do not ask to be redeemed through attention. They ask to be acknowledged accurately, to be seen not as lessons, but as lives shaped by forces that still exist. Chapter 10 continues here, with remembrance as responsibility rather than tribute, with the understanding that how we remember determines what we normalize. When we tell these stories carefully, we resist repetition. When we tell them carelessly, we invite it. What remains, then, is not a moral conclusion. It is a practice, to listen without taking, to remember without consuming, to speak without replacing the voices that were denied. There is no final lesson that resolves these stories, no conclusion that restores what was taken, no moral that redeems the systems that shape them. What remains is not an answer, but a question, one that refuses to stay in the past. The sisters in this book lived different lives, under different names, in different centuries. Some were displayed, some were hidden, some were celebrated, some were erased, but none were given the same thing freely. Choice. Choice over how they were seen. Choice over how their lives were narrated. Choice over what parts of themselves belonged to others. The harm they endured did not always come from cruelty. More often, it came from certainty, from people convinced they knew what was best, from systems confident in their authority, from audiences certain their curiosity was harmless. That certainty still exists. It exists whenever care is offered without consent, whenever protection is used to justify control, whenever silence is mistaken for agreement. The difference now is that we can see the pattern, and seeing changes responsibility. We are no longer innocent observers of history. We are participants in how it is remembered, repeated, or resisted. The way we tell these stories, what we emphasize, what we omit, what we demand from them, shapes the conditions that allow similar harm to continue. The sisters in these chapters do not ask us to feel sorry for them. They ask us to be honest about the systems that benefited from their bodies, their silence, their obedience, honest about the ease with which harm disguises itself as care, honest about how often survival is misread as success. They also ask something quieter and harder. They ask us to pause before consuming another story of difference, to ask who controls the narrative, to consider whether attention is being offered or taken. Not every story needs to be shared. Not every life needs to instruct. Not every silence needs interpretation. Some stories ask only to be held carefully. If there is a legacy here, it is not inspiration, it is restraint. Restraint in how we look, restraint in how we speak, restraint in how we decide for others. The final question this book leaves is simple, but it is not easy. When we encounter vulnerability, will we listen or will we decide? The answer to that question does not belong to history. It belongs to the present and to what we choose to do next.